Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to start to get a little bit into animation and talk about some of the tools and the basic principles behind it, as well as some of the main features of the 3ds Max interface that you'll be using to work on animation. So let me kickstart this and get you started with this. Okay, so the main parts of the interface we'll be using for this are basically down here. The time slider, for example, the actual timeline itself. We'll also be using these keying tools over here. So we have auto key, set key, and also the actual button here for dropping keyframes. We also have some playback controls over here and so on and so forth. And we're also going to be working with something called the curve editor. We'll open the curve editor in a bit. So how can we do some very basic simple animation in 3ds Max? Well, it's pretty simple. What we'll do is get this time slider over here and move it back to frame 0. At frame 0, we want to set a keyframe or a place, a point in time and space where 3ds Max is going to record the location and the position and that time of that sphere. So it's pretty simple. First thing we're going to do is we're going to activate set key mode. So click on set key down here, and now your viewport is going to be highlighted in red to let you know, hey, you're in set key mode. Okay, so now with set key mode activated, what we're going to do is we're going to click right here on this button that has this key icon, and that's going to set a key. That's going to set a key for the translation, the rotation, and the scaling of this sphere. Now what we'll do is we'll move the time slider all the way to the end to frame 100, and what we're going to do is move the sphere to the other side of the grid over here. Now click on the keyhole icon again to set some keys. And you notice that here in the timeline you'll see keys represented with these little different colored tick marks, as you can see. Now the tick marks, you can grab them and you can actually drag them with the left mouse button to anywhere that you want. In this case, I'm going to leave this one at frame 0. And I'm going to leave this one at frame 100. I'll go to frame 50, which is halfway in between. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set another key. So I'll click on set key. And now we have 3 keyframes. One at frame 0, one at 50, and another keyframe at frame 100. So now I'll go to frame 25, which is in between 0 and 50. And I'll move this sphere up like so. And then I'll click on set keys. So now when I go back and I move the little time slider, I can see the sphere goes up, then goes down, and then it slides across. So let's go to frame 75 and let's move this up in the Z-axis like so and hit the set key command. And now when we go back, we'll see the sphere goes up, and down and down. Okay, so it's a very simple example of keyframe animation 3ds Max. Okay, so you have these different keyframes. We can grab them, we can move them around. You can go ahead and highlight them and delete them by hitting delete on the keyboard. You can get rid of them. So there's a lot of ways that you can edit this stuff in 3ds Max. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to open up the curve editor to see what's happening under the hood. To be able to edit the animation more precisely and with more control, we need to use the curve editor. So there's a couple of ways we can open up the curve editor. We can go ahead and click on this icon down here, which is going to open up the mini curve editor. And now you should get this mini curve editor that pops up down here below. You can have access to a lot of different tools for animation here. Now I'm going to click this close button to get rid of it. I'm going to open up the other curve editor. We can also open up the curve editor by coming here to the main toolbar and going up to this icon. It kind of looks like a graph, and this is the curve editor. So click that to open it. Okay, so here's the curve editor, and the curve editor is going to allow us to have more control over animation. So I'll just move the curve editor up here, kind of a little bit out of the way so I can see what's going on in my viewport over here. Okay, now you can see we have a series of curves. These curves represent animation, well, through curves. And the different curves are color coded differently. For example, this blue curve here represents the movement of this sphere in the Z-axis. This red curve represents the X-axis, and there's a green curve, although it's a little bit difficult to see. It's in between these sets of curves here, represents the y-axis. Okay, so what we can do with these curves is we can adjust them and change them to what we want. So as I move the time slider, you can see there's another time slider here in the curve editor that's tracking the movement of those curves. And these little gray tick marks here are the actual keyframes themselves at those points in time. And if I select them, they turn white. And I could click an empty space to deselect them. Okay, so here's one of those tick marks right here at frame 25. So this is frame 25, and here's the actual keyframes for that part of the animation. I can adjust and change this to my heart's content. For example, I can move over here to frame 25. Say I want this sphere to bounce up a little bit higher. Well, I can take this curve here, which represents the z-axis, and I can move it up. And when I move it up, you'll see that the sphere moved up even higher. So now it bounces up higher and then low, as you can see. So it goes up and then down. Pretty simple stuff. I can also change the x-axis by adjusting this curve, but in this case, I really don't want to do that. I just wanted to adjust the height of the sphere, the height of that first bounce. Now, if you want to get a better visual representation of what's going on here with this sphere, we can actually do something. With the sphere selected, right-click to open up a quad menu. Then, go down to Object Properties to open up the Object Properties window. In this Object Properties window, what we want to look for is an option called Trajectory. It's located down here under Display Properties. By default, it's turned off. So click on it to turn it on and hit OK. Now what you get is a visual representation of the trajectory of this sphere during its animation. So this sphere is going to follow that curve right there. See that? So we'll know exactly where the sphere is going and when it's going to be there, which is great for animation. Now right here we have this sort of slopey curve. Now that's no good because we want it to look like this sphere is bouncing off the floor. If it curves down like that, it looks more like an airplane in flight or something like that doing acrobatics than a ball bouncing off the ground. So how can we fix that? Well, we're going to go over here to where that sphere bounces on the floor, which is frame 50. What we'll do is we'll drag select in the curve editor and select all of those tick marks, which are the keyframes. Right now they're using something called spline interpolation. Basically, what 3ds Max does, it evaluates the point here of this tick mark or this keyframe, and the point here, and the point here, and the point all the way over here. And it goes ahead and it interpolates or calculates the movement of the sphere. You see, we didn't have to tell 3D Max that between this point and this point here to drop the sphere down. 3D Max already calculated and went, okay, the quickest way for me to get from point A to point B is to go down like this. And then to make the movement look more fluid, it does a spline interpolation, which gives it this nice slopey curve. Now the nice slopey curve looks great when the sphere is going up because it looks like gravity starts to take over and then it just slowly comes back down again. But when it hits the ground, it can't do that. It's supposed to hit the ground and just pop back up. So to fix that, we'll select the keyframes that are located at frame 50 right here, and we have to change their interpolation. I have to change it from spline interpolation to linear interpolation to get rid of that slopey curve. So watch what happens to the trajectory curve when I make this change. With those keyframes selected, up here in the curve editor, I have different options for different types of interpolations. For example, I have step tangent interpolation. I have also different ways of interpolating the curves when they come into the keyframes and when they go out. I can also put smooth interpolation, which is that spline interpolation that is on by default. Or I could turn on the linear interpolation, which is this one right here. So let's click on that, and you notice the curves now become tighter. They don't curve, they just go straight and then back down, or back straight wherever they're going. And now when I update this, or I just click on this viewport and move it around, it updates automatically. You'll notice now the curve looks different. The curve goes straight down, bop, hits the ground, and then keeps going along its path or wherever it is that it's going. Okay, so now when I move this, it looks like it hits the ground and just bounces off. See that? So in order to play this, let's go here and hit play in the playback animation controls. So let's hit play. Sphere goes up, drops, hits the ground, and continues with its momentum or whatever, going wherever it is that it's going. Hit the pause button to stop the animation in place. We can then use these buttons like previous frame to go back one frame at a time, or next frame to go forward one frame at a time. We can then use go to end to go to the last frame of the animation, and go to start to go back to the first frame of the animation. Let me show you some of the shortcut keys to be able to do this faster. If you hit the / key next to shift on your keyboard, you'll go ahead and activate the play button. So the / key is the shortcut key to activate play. If I hit it again, it pauses. If I hit home on the keyboard, I go back to the first frame of the animation. End on the keyboard goes to the last frame of the animation. If I want to go ahead and cycle through the animation frame by frame backwards, I can hit comma on the keyboard. If I hold it down, it'll just keep going. If I press it once, it'll go frame by frame. If I hit the period key that's next to that one, I'll go forward in the timeline of the animation here. So I can hit it one key at a time, or hold it down to scrub forward, or I could scrub backwards. So those are very helpful shortcut keys to move around in the time slider down here. Okay, so what's auto key? What in the world does that do? Well, I'll show you what that does. I'm going to go ahead and highlight and select all of these keyframes in the timeline. And you notice that they're all highlighted and selected in white. What I'll do next is simply hit delete on the keyboard, and that'll delete the entire animation. Let me deactivate set key mode. Let me go back to keyframe 1 or keyframe 0. I'll select the sphere and I'll move it back down here to the beginning of the grid. I'm going to turn on auto key. Okay. Now what auto key is going to do is it's going to set the keying mode into automatic mode. This means that every time I move or make a change to the sphere, 3D Max is going to go ahead and keyframe the sphere automatically for me. So let me show you. Right now we can see we have no keyframes in the timeline. So let me grab the sphere and let me just move it around a little bit. Made a mistake again. We're going to start again in 3, 2, 1. So let's go ahead and set the first keyframe of the animation. So click on the key icon to set that up, and you see there's the keyframe. Now let's move to the end of the animation all the way here to frame 100. And let's move the sphere along its z-axis, or the x-axis, I'm sorry, all the way to the end of the grid. Now you'll notice that over here, auto key feature automatically put a keyframe. But because I only moved the sphere in the x-axis, it only keyframed the movement in the x-axis. It didn't keyframe rotation, it didn't keyframe scaling, and it didn't keyframe movement in the z or the y-axis. Depending on what you're animating and your style of animating, that could be a good thing or it might not. You might want that or you might not want that. But it really depends on what kind of project you're working on and the type of animation that you do. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave that alone. I'm going to move the time slider back to frame 50, and I'm going to go ahead and leave this here. I'm going to set a keyframe because I want it to be keyframe there, so I'll set a keyframe there. I'll go back to frame 25, and I'm going to move this up in the z-axis like so. And you notice that it automatically was keyframed. Okay. Now I'll go back to frame 75, and I'll move this up like so. Okay. And maybe I'll move it back like this. Okay, there we go. So it got automatically keyframed. I'll go back to frame 50. I'm going to select all the key frames right there, and I'll select linear interpolation. So there we go. So now it's linear, and there we go. We just used the auto key feature to automatically set some of the keyframes here for us. The keyframe at 75, 100, and 25 were automatically set by 3D Studio Max. All it did was detect any changes that we made at that point in the timeline, and it automatically keyframed only the parameters that were changed. In this case, the parameter that was changed was the X value for the movement, and the Z value for the movement as well when we moved this up at frame 25 and when we moved it up at frame 75. So there we go. Now let's hit the / key to play, and there it goes. And by default it'll continue to loop over and over again. So let's look at the time configuration settings here, and we can change the behaviors. You can see loop is turned on. So if we turn that off and hit OK, hit home on the keyboard to go back to the first frame, and then hit / to play the animation, you notice now when it gets to the end, it just stops. Okay, so that's a quick run through of the curve editor and some very basic animation principles in 3ds Max and the different tools and the interface and the different elements here that you would use when working on animation in 3ds Max.